Hi everybody, it's Dr. Klingman again. This is part 2 of how to structure your literature review paper. The purpose of this PowerPoint is to address part of the discussion and synthesis of results, and those would be the subsections for gaps in the evidence and limitations of the literature review. In the previous PowerPoint, we talked already about the introduction, the search methods, and the search results summary. We also talked about a good part of the discussion and synthesis of results sections. Those are the items that have check marks here. We talked about how you might open with a general statement about the results and then discuss each theme that was seen in your review of the literature. However, 2 additional things should also be included in the discussion and synthesis of results, and those are the gaps in the literature, what was missing from the evidence when you did your search, and limitations of the review. Usually when people write literature review papers, they briefly discuss what the limitations of their particular search might have been. Also just want to address briefly how to incorporate these latter 2 items into the clinical implications and conclusions section. This last section is actually preparing you for what the next step in the research process would be, which would be to utilize your review of the literature to guide whatever research or quality improvement project you wanted to do. Again, this is just a brief reminder about how you might start the discussion and synthesis of results section. I'm not going to go through this again. We talked about it already in the first PowerPoint. And as you can see over in the bottom left corner of this slide, I left on the original audio that went with that slide. Feel free to ignore that one if you've already listened to the other slide presentation. Again, this is a repeat of a slide from the first presentation that talks about how you would discuss things in the synthesis and results section. And we talked there about themes, and I used a little example of testing the effect of bedtime music on morning agitation. And so here, this just repeats that. Again, the original audio is down here in the lower left corner. But then once you're done discussing these themes, there are 2 more things to put in this section of your paper. And the 2 things that result from your synthesis of the literature are gaps in the evidence. That's gaps in the evidence that's available for you to use, and limitations of this review. That would be limitations in how to use the results of your literature review given the way that you did the search. The example articles that are posted in Module 5 for the systematic reviews and meta-analyses have examples of gaps in the evidence and limitations of the reviews. They're pretty elaborate. Yours will likely be much, much simpler. These can be very short sections at this point in your career. However, they are necessary as part of synthesizing the results. So the first issue is gaps in the evidence. What information was missing when you went looking for evidence to answer your PICO question, your clinical question? I don't think anybody found exactly what they wanted. And that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as you know what you're dealing with, and make sure to tell the reader of your paper that what the gaps are. So just kind of bouncing off of the example that we discussed earlier in this presentation, let's say you set out looking for information about the effect of music on sleep, but all you really found was the effect of music on how tired people felt during the day. You could surmise that had something to do with how they slept, but it's not really what you wanted. You might have wanted total sleep time or something quantitative like that. Or did you maybe set out looking for the effect of a particular intervention on adolescent males, but only found data and articles on samples that were mixed male and female adolescents? Well, you're not going to throw the data away. You're going to use it, but there's a gap there. Nobody studied all males, for example, or very few people studied all males. Or let's say that you wanted to know about the effect of meal frequency on quality of life, but only found articles about the effect of diet on body mass index. Okay, so those might be some examples of what kind of information is missing. What you want to do with this is to make readers cautious about using the results of your review of the literature. The assignment described, the final assignment, the gap closure proposal, in the syllabus, there's a description there of types of gaps that you might find from a literature review. So be sure to read through that as well. But if on the miraculous case that nothing was missing from your review, if you were able to find exactly what you wanted, great, say that. And say there appeared to be no gaps in the literature because blah, blah, blah. Support your statement. Don't just say it without supporting it. But do at least point out that you are addressing the issue that there might have been gaps in the evidence. And then finally, part of the synthesis of your results is to point out what limitations might be in the review results because of how the review was done. And almost every review article has a section on limitations of this review. So some of the limitations, and I believe, again, that the examples that were posted in Module 5 had discussed some limitations of the review. So how might, for example, your inclusion and exclusion criteria have limited what was found? And maybe you eliminated some articles because of this, or if you did not eliminate any because of that, that's good to say too. For example, I think some of the articles said, the review is limited by the fact that we only included articles in English and Japanese. Perhaps there was something in other languages. However, it should be pointed out that we did not eliminate any based on this criteria. Or perhaps you only included certain levels of evidence, like 1, 2, and 3. Then you need to say only level of evidence, blah, 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 were included. And this could limit the depth of the review because X, Y, and Z. Or, of course, we limited you to a certain number of articles. What does that mean? So those are some limitations of how your inclusion and exclusion criteria might be limiting the value of the results of your literature review. You should also address how your search method might have limited what was found. For example, you are only finding things that are indexed in the databases that you searched, maybe CINAHL, maybe Medline, maybe PsycInfo. That means that you're not finding anything that was in the gray literature. What does that mean? And perhaps other databases that maybe focus on, say, education could have been used. There are a bunch of other databases that could be used. You don't have to be super thorough here, but be sure to address the fact that there are limitations. And of course, another big one about your search methods is the years that you searched. Okay, so that covers the limitations of this review, meaning this paper. So to sum all this up then, your discussion and synthesis of results section of the paper, which is big, this is where we said you show your chops as a nurse practitioner, this would be your major heading, discussion and synthesis of results, and it would probably look something like this. You'd have an opening paragraph or two, and then you'd have a subheading for some themes, then you'd have a subheading that's called gaps in the evidence, and then you'd have another subheading that has limitations of this review. There is one more major heading that I said we would talk about in this PowerPoint. And drum roll please, this gets us to the final section of your paper, the clinical implications and conclusions section. This is where you bring it all together, as we talked about in the first presentation. This little speaker down here in the left corner is the exact same audio from the first presentation, so there's no need to listen to that again here. But what I wanted to talk about in this presentation is how to sort of weave in your limitations and gaps in the evidence into the clinical implications and conclusions section. So what you would do is, I mean, everything has limitations. So be positive, say, in spite of the limitations, the data and results are valuable because of their applicability to blah, blah, blah. It's a good idea to, again, remind the reader of what the clinical question was, to kind of bring it back to that, since that was the purpose of the paper. Also, if you did find gaps in the evidence, this might be a positive thing. What you'll see in your gap closure paper, which is the next assignment, is that you'll be recommending ways to close gaps. So, you could say that there's opportunity to close the gap or to do quality improvement or whatever. You don't have to go into a lot of detail. This section can be short, but bring it all together, bring it all back to focus on the clinical question. All right, everybody? Great. This is it. You can really do this.